Hey everyone, welcome. Ready to dive into something really cool.
Definitely. Let's do it.
Okay, so today we're tackling how our brains actually recognize, like things.
Object recognition. It's pretty wild stuff.
Right. And not just seeing a coffee mug, but like how do we know it's a coffee mug no matter which way it's turned?
And then there's how we group those things. Like what makes something a sport, even if it's totally different from another sport.
We've got excerpts from a cognitive psych textbook, plus some really visual stuff to help us see what's going on.
Should be fun.
Totally. So, right off the bat, the book talks about these different levels of categories.
Okay, I'm listening.
Like, animal is super broad, right? Then you get more specific with bird, even more with black-capped chickadee.
It's like zooming in on a map, getting more and more detailed.
Exactly. But the question is, at what level do we usually think? Like, do we see a robin and go bird first or animal?
Research suggests we tend to operate at that basic level, bird in this case. It's efficient, especially for familiar things.
Makes sense. But what about when we only see part of something? Like a chair with a blanket over it. Do we need to see every detail?
That's where top-down processing comes in. Our brain uses what it already knows to fill in the gaps.
So it's like our brain is saying, well, I see those chair legs and it's in a living room, so.
Exactly. It's using context clues along with the actual sensory data, which is bottom-up processing.
Oh, speaking of context, there's this image, a rabbit hiding in glass asking, can you identify me?
I love that. It proves a point, right?
Totally. A flash of white fur could be anything, but put it in that setting and boom, rabbit.
Shows how much our brains rely on those environmental hints to solve the puzzle of what we're seeing.
And it's not just about what we see, but the angle too, right? The textbook calls this perspective.
Right, like with those pictures of the Prius, one from the side, one from the front. The side view is the canonical perspective.
The most typical viewpoint, the one our brains are most used to seeing.
Makes recognition faster. It's like a mental shortcut for those everyday objects.
Makes you wonder, do our brains store images from every angle? Like, how do I always spot my car in a packed lot?
That's priming. Even if you only glimpsed it before, your brain's got a head start on recognizing it again, even turned around.
Huh. So it's like our brain is always preloading info based on what we've seen before.
Yeah.
Wild.
It's constantly working in the background. But let's get into those two big approaches to object recognition, parts-based and image-based.
Oh, yeah. It's like, do we see the whole forest or each tree individually first?
Exactly. Parts-based is all about breaking things down into components, like those genes the textbook talks about.
Those basic shapes, like a visual alphabet our brain uses to build up recognition.
Precisely. Like with those gene images, they're like the building blocks. And even if an object is rotated, those relationships stay the same.
So our brain isn't fooled by a chair just because it's turned sideways. We still see those chain relationships.
Exactly. Now, image-based is more like taking a snapshot of the whole thing. Like when you're searching for Waldo, you're not looking for his elbow and then his hat.
You're looking for his overall shape, that red and white pattern, against a busy background.
Exactly. It seems both approaches are at play, though. Familiar objects may be more parts-based, but something totally new, maybe more image-based to start.
It's like our brain has different strategies, picking the best one for the job.
Exactly. And then there's template matching. But it's too rigid of an idea, right? Like, we'd need a template for every variation of every object.
Our poor brains would be overflowing, so while it might play a small role, it can't be the whole story.
Agreed. But you know what's even more incredible than recognizing objects?
Faces. Because, yeah, that's kind of essential for, like, life.
It is. We navigate a world full of strangers because our brains can do this amazing thing.
But is it special? Or just another object, just, more complex?
Well, there's prosopagnosia, where people can't recognize faces, even their own. Suggests there's something unique happening there.
Wow, so their brain sees the features but can't put it together as that person. That's got to be tough.
It is. And here's another thing. Ever noticed how much harder it is to recognize a face upside down compared to an object?
Oh, for sure. Like, way harder. Makes my brain hurt just thinking about it.
That's the face inversion effect. Suggests we process faces more holistically, as a whole unit, not just individual features.
Like, we're not going, okay, two eyes, one nose. It's the entire configuration at once.
Right. There was this study with sketches of houses and faces, both whole and in parts. People were way better at recognizing whole faces.
More so than houses, so it's not just that faces are more complex in general.
Exactly. Points to our brains being hardwired for this. But some argue it's because we're just experts in faces.
I see them every day from the moment we're born, so practice makes perfect.
And think about it. Aren't you better at recognizing faces within your own culture? Research shows that we are. Experience matters.
So maybe it's both. Like, we're primed for faces, and then life fine-tunes that skill.
That's the beauty of the brain, constantly adapting and specializing. But there's that thing we've all
Oh
experienced.
no, you're not going to say it.
Recognizing someone, but the name. Gone. Tip of the tongue. The worst.
Seriously. And it's always the people you should remember the names of, right?
There's actually a reason it happens. Recognizing the face is the easiest part, then remembering stuff about them, and lastly, the name.
Like levels of remembering, and names are the final boss.
Exactly. Names are often that unique, isolated piece of info, not as connected in our mental networks.
It's easier to remember, oh, the barista with the cool tattoos, than that's Sarah.
Precisely. Plus, different parts of the brain handle names versus faces, like two filing systems that don't always talk to each other well.
So frustrating. But when we do remember, it's either serial or parallel processing, right?
Like searching one file at a time versus having multiple tabs open on your computer. Serial is slow, parallel is that aha moment.
But why does the name often lose that race?
Other info, like their job, might be linked to lots of people, making it a stronger signal. The name, being unique, gets drowned out.
So my brain have all this info, but the name's stuck in traffic.
Sadly, yes. And hey, at least we recognize them, right? Which brings us to a whole other level.
Yeah.
How we group those individuals into categories.
Like, how do we know that golden Oreo, even without the chocolate, is still an Oreo?
Exactly. Which brings us to essentialism.
It's like our brains get that there's this essence of Oreo-ness that goes beyond just how it looks.
Right. And we do this with all sorts of categories. Like, you see a dog, you just know it's a dog.
Even if you've never seen that breed before, there's just something about it.
It's that essential quality, that dogness, that ties them all together.
And this whole essentialism thing, it's not just about Oreos and dogs, right? It shapes how we see the world, even other people.
Absolutely. But before we get into all that, let's stick with how essentialism works with categories themselves.
Good point. Got to understand the foundation before you build the house, right?
Exactly. Remember those made-up creatures, the sorps from
Yeah.
the research?
Oh, yeah. The researchers described them, then changed either their appearance or something about their nature. Wild.
Even when a sorp started looking like something else,
Yeah.
people still categorized it based on its essential nature, that core part of what it is.
So even if it started looking like, I don't know, a weird insect, but its sorpness stayed the same.
People were like, nope, still a sorp. It proves our categories aren't just surface level. We're looking for those deeper principles.
Which brings us right back to the golden Oreo. It messed with our sense of what an Oreo is.
Totally. Take away the chocolate, and suddenly we're questioning everything we thought we knew about Oreos.
And for a lot of people, it came down to that cream and the cookie texture. The color was different, but it didn't change what it was.
Fascinating, right? But, this whole discussion about how we categorize things.
It makes those moments when we can't figure something out even weirder.
Right, like when our brains just stall out. Not a memory thing, but
I knew someone who swore they couldn't see faces in those abstract art pieces. Is that what you mean?
could be. Unfamiliar things, especially without context, are tricky. But even normal objects can throw us off if they're out of place.
Out of place how?
The textbook mentioned this study with a mailbox in a kitchen.
Okay, now that's just mean. Who puts a mailbox in the kitchen?
And people had a much harder time identifying it there compared to a mailbox on the street. Context is huge.
Our brains are like, mailbox street, makes sense. Mailbox kitchen, total system error.
It shows how much we rely on predictions based on past experience.
Yeah.
When something breaks that, even a mailbox is confusing.
I never realize how much work my brain is doing behind the scenes just to make sense of the world.
We take it for granted, right? Speaking of which, remember how we talked about face recognition being amazing?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out there are individual differences in how we do it. Like, some people are just better at it.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not great at everything.
Right. But it goes beyond just general skill. Things like gender and cultural background play a role too.
So it's not just about how our brains are wired, but also the world we experience as we grow up.
Exactly. For example, research suggests women might be better at recognizing facial expressions on average.
Huh, interesting. Any idea why that might be?
One theory is that women, historically, have been encouraged to be more attuned to social cues and emotions.
So over time, that focus could have actually changed how their brains process faces.
It's possible. And there's a study that kind of backs this up. Researchers showed people line drawings of faces and trees, both right side up and upside down.
Like those abstract face images we have?
Those are the ones. Women were better at recognizing the upright faces, and it wasn't because of general intelligence or how well they could see.
Wow. So there's something specific about how women's brains were processing the features.
Seems that way. It really highlights how gender roles and social experiences can shape our brains. But culture plays a role too.
Oh, yeah. I bet different cultures with different social norms, that's got to influence how we see faces.
There's research comparing Eastern and Western cultures. People from Eastern cultures tend to focus more on the center of the face, especially the nose,
Really? And Westerners?
more on the eyes and mouth.
Wow, that's so interesting. I wonder why the difference, though.
Could be about cultural norms around eye contact. In some Eastern cultures, direct eye contact can be seen as rude, so.
So people might learn to avoid focusing on the eyes. Makes
Yeah.
sense.
And get this, those cultural differences in looking at faces actually affected how well people recognize them. People were better at recognizing faces from their own race.
So it's like we're literally seeing faces differently based on our culture. That's both really cool and kind of alarming.
It is. It's a reminder that we all have these unconscious biases shaped by our experiences. But speaking of unique experiences, what about recognizing ourselves?
I've never thought of that as a skill, really. You just know it's you in the mirror.
Right. But it's directly tied to our sense of self. The textbook mentioned a case of someone with prosopagnosia who couldn't even recognize themselves.
Oh, wow, that's so sad. To not even recognize your own reflection.
It really makes you realize how important that is for our identity.
Definitely. So is there something different about how we process our own face compared to others?
Some researchers think so. Some primates can recognize other faces, but they totally fail the mirror test, even with training.
The mirror test.
Yeah, where they put a mark on the animal and see if it recognizes itself in the mirror.
Oh, right. So some animals, they never make that connection.
Exactly. It suggests self-recognition might be a more complex cognitive skill, even for animals that are good at recognizing other faces.
Wow, that's really interesting. But it kind of brings me back to that feeling of seeing someone and forgetting their name. Why is that so hard?
Well, we touched on it earlier, but it's partly because names are often those unique, isolated pieces of information. They don't have as many strong connections in our mental networks.
Right. It's easier to remember the barista with the cool tattoos than Sarah. Like those details are more memorable.
Exactly. And on top of that, different parts of the brain handle names versus faces. It's like trying to connect two dots that are miles apart.
So my brain literally has to work harder to put those two things together.
It's more like they're not always wired to connect easily. And there's actually a term for this, difficulty gradient. Recognizing the face is the first step, then remembering things about them, and finally, the hardest, the name.
So it's like levels of remembering and names are the boss level. No wonder it feels impossible sometimes.
It's true. One study showed this where people could recognize a face, give some details about them, but totally blank on the name.
It's like having a file folder with all the info but no label. The worst.
The worst.
Hmm?
But when we do remember a name, there are two main ways it can happen: serial processing or parallel processing.
Right, like searching through a filing cabinet one drawer at a time versus having multiple tabs open on your computer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Serial processing means we have to recognize the face, then access their info, and then maybe, just maybe, the name comes.
But sometimes it feels like the name just pops into your head out of nowhere.
And that's more like parallel processing. It's like all the information about that person is being activated at the same time, competing for your attention.
So it's a race in our brains, and the name doesn't always win.
Especially if other information, like their job, is more active in your mind because you associate it with lots of people.
Huh. Our brains are weird.
To say the least.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, at least we recognize them, right? Now, shifting gears a bit. Remember those two main types of categories we talked about before? Natural kinds versus artifact categories.
Oh, right, like dogs versus chairs.
Exactly. Natural kinds, plants, animals, rocks, they exist whether humans are around to name them or not. They just are.
But chairs, we invented those. No humans, no chairs.
Precisely. And the textbook points out that natural kinds tend to be more stable across time and cultures. Like, a dog is a dog, whether you're in Japan or Brazil.
But a chair, That could look like 1,000 different things depending on where you are in the world and what it's used for.
Exactly. Artifact categories are much more susceptible to cultural influences, trends, technology, all of that.
It's like a traditional Japanese tea ceremony chair versus some super modern ergonomic office chair. Both chairs, but
Have you?
so different.
And that's because artifact categories are all about human purpose. We
Yeah.
create them to fit our needs and desires, which change a lot across cultures and time periods.
It's like even our understanding of a simple word like chair is shaped by our own little corner of the world.
Exactly. We take categories for granted, but they're actually very fluid and flexible, constantly being shaped by our experiences.
And by experiences, you mean not just what we see, but our culture, our individual quirks, everything.
It all plays a role. Which brings us to a really cool way of visualizing how we organize all this knowledge in our heads. Semantic networks.
Ah, yes, our mental maps. Like that diagram we have with canary, bird, and animal all linked together.
That's the one. Remember this fretting activation model. When we think about a canary, that activation spreads to related concepts.
Like ripples in a pond. Canary, then bird, then maybe even yellow, since, a lot of canaries are yellow.
Exactly.
Mm.
And the further out the ripple goes, the weaker the activation gets. But it helps explain how we make those connections so quickly.
Our brains are like constantly making these subconscious leaps between ideas, whether we realize it or not.
And this model even helps explain priming. Remember that. If we're exposed to the word yellow, it's easier to recognize lemon later on.
Because yellow sort of pre-activates lemon in our minds, gives it a head start.
Exactly. Like our brains are always one step ahead, anticipating what's coming next.
So our brains are like prediction machines,
Yeah.
always trying to stay one step ahead based on what we've encountered before.
That's one way to put it. And this predictive power is a big part of what makes us so adaptable and efficient. But it can also lead to some quirks.
Quirks! Like what? You're going to have to elaborate on that.
Okay, well, think about it this way. Our brains want to categorize things, right? Makes the world easier to understand.
Totally. Puts things in their neat little boxes.
Except sometimes those boxes get blurry. Like, is bowling a sport? Is a hot dog a sandwich?
Oh, don't even get me started on those debates. Everyone's got an opinion.
Exactly. The classical view of categories with those strict rules, it kind of falls apart in real life. Things are messier than that.
It's like those signs that say, keep off the grass, but then half the grass is already gone, and you're like, but where does it begin?
Exactly. That's where graded structure and fuzzy boundaries come into play.
So instead of those hard lines, we've got categories where some members are like, the Ulster MVPs.
Perfect analogy. Think about furniture. A chair, a sofa, a bed. Those are the Hall of Famers of the furniture category.
But then you have things like lamps, rugs, even a really big houseplant. Still technically furniture, but not as central to the idea, right?
You got it. And this isn't just our opinion. Research shows people generally agree on which things are the most chair-like chairs and which are kind of on the outskirts of that category.
So even though I can't give you a perfect definition of furniture that covers every single thing, we still have this shared understanding of what makes a chair a chair.
Precisely. And those fuzzy boundaries, they get even more obvious with categories like things to take on vacation, what you pack for the beach versus, say, a skiing trip. Totally different.
And even within those trips, what I think is essential is probably way different from what you'd pack.
Exactly. It becomes about individual experience and perspective. What makes something belong isn't always objective features, but our understanding of that category.
Golden Oreo all over again. Whether it's a real Oreo depends on what you think makes an Oreo in the first place.
Which brings us to this really deep question, and it kind of underlies everything we've been talking about.
Oh, and I'm intrigued.
What makes something what it is? How do we decide where to draw those lines, even if they're a little blurry?
It's like that whole if a tree falls in the forest
Mhm.
thing, right? But instead of sound, it's like if a cookie doesn't have chocolate, is it still an Oreo?
Exactly. And essentialism plays a huge role in how we answer that. We're looking for that core identity, that defining something that makes a thing what it is.
And while our experiences and cultures influence that, there must be some universal principles, right? Like how we're all good at recognizing faces, even if some are easier than others.
Right, or how we just get the difference between a living thing and an object. Those are hardwired.
So it's like we're all working from the same basic blueprint, but then get to customize and decorate our own mental houses, so to speak.
Love that analogy. And Like those houses, our mental categories are always evolving as we encounter new things.
So it's not about finding the perfect way to categorize everything, because that's probably impossible anyway.
It's more about recognizing that our categories are fluid, always open to being tweaked as we learn.
Which is extra important when it comes to how we categorize other people, right?
Huge. Because if we cling too tightly to those rigid categories, we miss out on the nuance of individual experience.
We might misinterpret, judge unfairly, all because our mental boxes are too small.
Exactly. It's like that saying, don't judge a book by its cover. But even deeper than that, don't judge a person by their category.
That's powerful. And a perfect way to wrap up this deep dive.
Agreed.
We've gone from the nitty-gritty of how our brains know a coffee mug when they see one.
To the philosophy of what makes a thing what it is. Not bad for one deep dive.
And it turns out those simple acts of recognition, of categorization, way more complex than we realize.
Shaped by our experiences, our culture, who we are as individuals.
It's like we peeled back the layers of our own minds today.
And hopefully you're walking away with a new appreciation for both the power and the potential pitfalls of how we categorize the world around us.
And maybe next time you're debating if a golden Oreo is truly an Oreo, or if bowling is a sport,
You'll remember that the answer is probably more interesting than you think.
keep those mental gears turning, everyone.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.